Of our four canonical New Testament Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, almost 40% deals with the 1 week period between Palm Sunday and Easter Sunday. The narratives start with Jesus entering Jerusalem on a donkey with palm fronds spread out before him as if he were a king. The climax finds Jesus executed for crimes against the state. And then there are the other stories. Tables turned over in the great temple, verbal tricks and logical traps thrown at Jesus by various authorities, foot washing, a Last Supper, an arrest, a trial, a lament, and finally, good news. And that's the story of the last week, Holy Week. Lots of good stuff in there. Today is Easter Sunday, and you have gathered here in a Unitarian Universalist church because you have admirable taste, exceedingly fine grooming, and brilliant intellectual distinction. You are, in short, entirely wonderful in every way. And did I mention that pledge season ends this week? But I digress. We don't talk about Jesus very much in UU churches. There is a long and somewhat tedious story for why that is, but the long and short of it is that we are the people that have questions, which is a nice way of saying folks find us annoying. Uncultured folks, to be sure. But we are famously leery of Jesus' Holy Week and miracles, aren't we? Those that take the Gospels at face value, we're quick to point out, have failed to engage with the text, take seriously the insights of modern science, or perhaps worst of all, have deliberately chosen to ignore the poetry, the metaphor, the layers of clear and obvious rhetoric, in many cases masterfully crafted by the Gospel writers. In short, if and when the subject of Jesus, the Bible, or Easter comes up, Unitarian Universalists suddenly become New York Times literary critics. It's just what we do. Easter, for many Christians across time and space, is the whole thing, the great big deal of it all. Later thinkers got very excited about the idea of sin, sacrifice, and salvation, the idea that God sacrificed himself to save us from himself, that Jesus had to die for our sins, unforgivable sins that we were born with because we are the descendants of the rebellious Adam and Eve way back in the Garden of Eden, that only through this blood atonement are we reconciled with the source, the Spirit, the one above all. The fact that you are here in a UU church means that you have at least started to unwind some of this theology and the grip it has had on the hearts and minds of Western civilization. To be blunt, we don't believe this. In fact, I'm deeply puzzled why anyone believes it. The gospel writers didn't believe it. Early Christians didn't believe it. Somehow, at some point, stories got added. Theologians and church leaders and even just regular church members embellished, colored up, got creative, thought deeply, wrote many volume treatises on who got it right and who got it wrong, with lots and lots of footnotes. 2,000 years of philosophy, creative writing, doctrine, heresy, orthodoxy, and theology later means that we have a lot to unwind if we ever want to get to the root of it all. So this morning, I'm not going to take up the cross carried by the Unitarians or the Universalists. Our stories of how our tradition responds to the good news of Easter, we'll return to that in future years. But today, I just want to talk a little bit about how it all started. And I want to start with a story. Before he was born, his mother had a visitor from heaven who told her that her son would not be a mere mortal, but in fact would be divine. His birth was accompanied by unusual signs in the heavens. As an adult, he left his home to begin an itinerant preaching ministry. He told any who would listen that they should not be concerned with material things. Instead, they should live for the spiritual. His closest followers believed he was the Son of God. He performed miracles. He healed the sick, cast out demons, and raised the dead. He was put on trial for crimes against Rome and was executed. He rose from the dead and appeared alive to some of his followers. These followers wrote books about him that we can read today, but it is unlikely that any of you have read these books, as they were written about Apollonius of Tyana, a pagan, a philosopher, and unlike a certain preacher from Galilee, numerous historical records show that Apollonius was very widely known in the first century of the Common Era, known even to the followers of Jesus of Nazareth. And the two groups cheerfully called each other charlatan and fraud. I think most of us would find this story of Apollonius kind of interesting for its many obvious parallels to the New Testament Gospels. But many of you also know that Apollonius is not the only story like this. Fact is, we have a lot of stories with clear parallels to the Jesus story. The stories told of the Buddha, Krishna, Odysseus, Romulus, Dionysus, Heracles, Zoroaster, Attis of Phrygia, and the Egyptian god Horus all contain such parallels, and all are significantly older than the Gospels. There we find virgin births, miraculous healing, temptation by the devil, the casting out of demons, people being raised from the dead, persecution, resurrection, and a whole lot more. In fact, the overlaps are so many and so obvious, us latter-day students of history and religion are left to wonder why none of the gospel authors got sued for plagiarism. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying the gospels are false, lies, or tricks. That's too easy and too disrespectful. What I am saying is that it is quite possible that the more miraculous elements we find in the Jesus narratives are literary tropes, very common to the empires of the Mediterranean up to the time the Gospels were written. Here's a fun little bit of scholarship. You know, because we've talked about it a couple weeks ago, you know that the Gospels were not written by Jesus, right? Everybody knows that? Nor were they written by the disciples. In fact, the earliest parts of the New Testament that we have are letters written by Paul, a man who never met Jesus and quotes astonishingly little from the man who he claimed was made God at his death. The earliest letters of Paul come from no earlier than 20 years after the death of Jesus. The Gospel of Mark came some 20 years after Paul's earliest letters. The Gospels of Luke and Matthew came 20 years after that. The Gospel of John, another 40 or so years later, and that's a lot of time. Now, the question scholars have of how it could be that we go from firsthand witnesses to our gospel accounts from that firsthand account to our gospel accounts with perhaps 70 or so years of telephone in between them. The question is, what happened to those stories in that time? Honestly, we can't know. Exactly. But one thing scholars suggest is that someone somewhere compiled a list of things Jesus must have said. Short, pithy one-liners. This list is called Q for the German word Quelle, which means source. And I think did I pronounce that? I did not pronounce that correctly. What is it? Quelle? Quelle. Ask the expert. That's what we all should do. Quelle. Okay. Anyway, what some scholars believe is that the later gospel writers, for at least some of their stories, took these important quotes that were well known and then constructed stories that made that quote made sense, pulling out what they knew from their friends, from their teachers, from what was being discussed at church, from what they may have read elsewhere, and just perhaps things that they may have confused with earlier, older, other stories. I am the resurrection and the life, for example, would have been featured in a story of someone being raised from the dead. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone might form the seed of a story of someone caught in adultery. It's just a theory, but it's suggestive. Has anyone seen the 2007 film, The Man from Earth? Anybody seen that film? You all have homework. A college professor is moving away. A bunch of his colleagues get the news and head over to his house just as the movers are taking away furniture. Now, to pass the time, these professors decide to play a game. It's basically a game of prove me wrong. The young professor that's leaving actually says, "No, I'm 14,000 years old." 14,000 years old. And the next 90 minutes of the film are him revealing details of his life in result to the questions that are asked him. One of those details included him meeting and studying with one Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, and talking about how he was very taken with the ideals of nonviolence, self-mastery, mindfulness, and yoga. He continues his story. A few centuries later, he began to teach these ideas in a small fishing village on the Galilean Sea. He got in trouble with the Roman authorities, was tied to his cross, and using yoga techniques, slowed his heart rate and faked his death. Later, he woke up, wriggled out of his ropes, and escaped into the night. And that is the story of Jesus. Everything else, according to this story, the baptism by John, the procession into Jerusalem, the Last Supper, the tomb, almost everything found in the four Gospels, all added after the fact by believers, followers, and storytellers. Or so the story of Professor John Oldman goes. As movies go, The Man from Earth is fascinating. For Easter, it's a little blasphemous. And aside from the 14,000-year-old man part, you could think that the Man from Earth is a dramatization of one possible explanation of at least how some of our Gospels came to be. The truth of the matter, whatever it is, may well be beyond us. But we do know some things. We do know about life in the Roman Empire. The Romans kept fantastic records. We know that in year 4 before the Common Era, and again in year 6 of the Common Era, riots in Jerusalem led to open rebellion. These rebellions were met with catastrophic Roman intervention. Many thousands of Jews were crucified, and a local Jewish leadership was replaced with direct Roman governance. Every year during the high holy days of Passover and the New Year, when pilgrims and pious Jews would travel from the rest of the Roman world to Jerusalem to make their annual sacrifices at the Jewish temple, the population of that city could swell from some 40,000 to over several 100,000. At these times, Roman governors would bring their legions and fill the streets with soldiers in order to try and keep the peace. Unrest was not tolerated. Rioters were met with murderous efficiency and a famous lack of concern between the guilty and the innocent. The local Jewish authorities, what was left of them, would have been terrified of having their wealth taken, their people slaughtered, and their temple destroyed. Terrified, and for very good reason. Now, in this context, there's a case to be made that the Jesus story, especially as told by the Gospel of Matthew, should be read as subversive. One can read the Gospels and hear the words of Jesus and become convinced he was an insurrectionist. Reza Aslan, in his 2013 book, Zealot, anybody read that one? That's pretty good. He makes a very good case for this kind of interpretation, that what Jesus really meant and what his disciples really wanted was to spark a Jewish rebellion, to instigate an uprising that would push Rome and Roman influence back into the sea, just like the Maccabees had done a few hundred years before with the Greeks. When it didn't happen, when Jesus failed as a traditional Messiah, Aslan argues, later writers tried to rewrite what the Messiah really meant. Not a war leader, but a God-man sacrificed for the sins of the world. Some scholars do find this compelling, others not so much. These other scholars find certain aspects of Holy Week as captured by the Gospels just a bit tough to take, though, at face value. Jesus riding into the city on a donkey like a king out of Jewish prophecy, with rapturous crowds throwing palm fronds in front of him, would not have been ignored by Roman authorities. Overturning tables, flogging money changers, and bringing to halt the function of the Jewish temple, the center of religious activity, in the middle of one of the most important times on the religious calendar? Unlikely. First, because the temple grounds were enormous, several football fields in size, and any disruption large enough to halt even a fraction of that space would have drawn immediate intervention from the thousands of Roman soldiers patrolling that area, specifically looking to make examples of just such troublemakers. The disciples defending Jesus at sword point in the Garden of the Gethsemane, even going so far as to lop the ear off of a Roman centurion, but miraculously avoiding being killed on the spot, or any of them ending up on a cross next to Jesus? Impossible to imagine, even if Jesus famously said to Peter, "If you live by the sword, you will die by the sword." A Roman governor presiding over the trial of a peasant? Not likely. A man convicted of treason and condemned to die on a cross would have been left on that cross, not removed or buried. So where do these stories come from if they couldn't have happened? We don't know. It's a mystery. What we do know is this. Jesus was a Judean Jew at a time when Judea was part of the Roman Empire. Jesus preached that the end of the world would arrive during the lifetime of those present. He did not preach the coming of a military Messiah. Instead, Jesus taught that God himself was going to come in power and in glory to personally wipe away Roman oppression and establish his kingdom of peace and equality here on earth. And when that failed to happen, when the years stretched into decades, we see it in the later gospel writers altering the emphasis of their stories. Jesus got de-apocalypticized. The agony of Jesus on the cross found in the early Gospel of Mark was replaced with this weird stoic remove of the Jesus on the cross in the Gospel of Luke. Jesus went from the man who became God at his death to the man who became God at his baptism, then his birth, then before the birth of the world itself. The stories grow and change. But none of that is what made the Jesus story the story that changed the world. And that is where I want to end today. Because it was not a lost list of pithy aphorisms or famous stories that may have been born out of them. It was not the fabulous tales of miraculous healing, the feeding of the multitudes, the passion of the cross. After all, in an age when life was anything but milk and honey, miracle stories were very common. Now, what made the Jesus story something different was what happened after all of that. As our friend Tom Durkin likes to say, it's the shift from the religion of Jesus to the religion about Jesus. And it all starts with that earliest gospel, the Gospel of Mark, or rather the ending of that gospel. As you may remember, Mark ends with Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Jesus, going to the tomb. There they find the stone rolled away, but the tomb was not empty. Instead, they find a mysterious figure who tells them that Jesus is not there. Quote, "He has been raised. He is not here. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." And in a wild twist of irony, the women do not do this. Instead, they, quote, "went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And that is it. That's all there is. Now, it doesn't take a Unitarian Universalist or a literary critic or a Bible scholar even to wonder what the early Christians thought of an ending like that. It's safe to say that the answer is not much. Because at some point, some editor decided that this cliffhanger was just not going to cut it. And maybe that is why, in later fragments, the Gospel of Mark suddenly finds itself with a different ending, albeit one written in a different style, with a different voice, using a new vocabulary, but still, it's attached to the end of the Gospel of Mark, 18 new verses. And in those verses, we learn that after the tomb, some of his followers reported that they had seen their crucified king, seen him alive. Some had spoken to him. First, he appears to Mary and Mary, then to 2 disciples, then to all of them together. And to them, the risen one gives a final commission to go forth into the world and proclaim the good news. Good news. What good news? Not sin, not salvation, not sacrifice, not redemption, not heaven or hell, not love. Just this, a simple, startling question. What if death is not the end? That whatever else the world and history and life may hold, what if death is not the end? Did their story grow in the telling? Maybe, probably. But this is the thing that sits at the core, the triumph of Christianity, the miracle that is Easter. Person to person, they told the story of this man who died, who somehow lived and walked the earth once more. Not hundreds or thousands of years ago, not in ancient stories, not in fantastic alien lands. Here, a place I have been, a place my family lives, a place my friend has visited. And this man, a person, a real person, a man I once met, a man that my friend knew, a man my grandfather saw. The man at the market today told me of this man his cousin knew, one of us. And the promise that despite illness and injury, despite war, despite plague and earthquake and shipwreck, despite Rome, maybe you can. Maybe those you love. Maybe all this. Maybe this isn't the end. What if? And so it went, person to person, town to town. A few became hundreds, hundreds grew to millions, from one simple peasant murdered by empire all the way to the emperor himself. The light, the way, the life, the resurrection. Whatever else is true or not true. Under all the exaggerations and misunderstandings, under all the history and the mystery, the revelations and the dogma, under all the priests, the preachers, the scholars, the activists, the evangelists, under all of them and all of that, whatever else it is, this story is a big story. Maybe the biggest we humans have ever told. And that is the story of Easter. Amen.
Visit us at uusg.org.